Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive than we normally do on these segments into the coronavirus response, the
Okay.
pandemic response, specifically the United States. Most people remember President Trump at the beginning standing at a podium. You had Fauci behind him. You had this government response. You had the lab coats, the doctors, the vaccine manufacturers, FDA, all promising transparency. But above all, it was a medical health agency response with the government.
Yeah.
But there was a separate response running parallel to that, and it was by the military. This military complex was also in there running this COVID response. And for people that may not have seen it, this is what it looked like on December 12th, 2020, when the FDA had just greenlighted Pfizer's COVID shot for emergency use authorization, and it was time to roll it out. Let's look at what the military was saying.
We checked our egos at the door. We worked collectively to solve the problem, and we have achieved success, as was identified last night by the FDA when they approved EUA of the Pfizer vaccine. Now we'll begin distribution of safe and effective vaccines to the American people. You have heard me refer to today as D-Day. Some people assumed that I meant day of distribution. In fact, D-Day in military designates the day the mission begins. D-Day was a pivotal turning point in World War II. It was the beginning of the end. D-Day was the beginning of the end, and that's where we are today.
And that was General Gustav Perna. He was directing kind of the distribution of Operation Warp Speed. But you can see there that there is a military flair to that. If this was the only video someone saw from the past, looking back into history, they'd say, wow, this really looks like the military was commanding this thing. And even before the coronavirus, a couple of years before that, we saw the military starting to get into collaboration with the FDA. Here's an article from 2017 in November, almost 2 years before we're actually knowing about the coronavirus. FDA and Pentagon in turf war over product approvals. And what they were talking about there was emergency use authorization products. The Pentagon, the Department of Defense, wanted really control over the emergency use authorization mechanism for times of war, times of biological attacks. They wanted to be able to fast track that on their own. And the FDA, hats off to them at that point. They actually did put down their foot and said, no, this is our wheelhouse. We want to remain control on this. So what happened was there was a compromise. Public Law 115-92, this is amended public law. And if we go into this and we look at it at the time, and this, again, it's 2017, this was an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to authorize additional emergency uses for medical products to reduce deaths and severity of injuries caused by agents of war and for other purposes. And right after that, there was a great article on this that broke it down really with the legalese and how it really affected the future of EUAs. In this article, if anybody wants to look at this really breaks it down, a new era of collaboration between the Department of Defense and the FDA. And now this thing gets moving a little bit. It says a compromise emerged between the positions of the DoD and FDA, whereby DoD would get both the expansion of the EUA authority beyond CBRN, that's chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, for battlefield trauma care, and an expedited approval mechanism for DoD medical priorities, but where FDA retained the exclusive authority to authorize an EUA. So right there, we have DoD being married to the FDA, especially when it comes to any type of threat, note biological, any type of threat that is going to be an issue, the DoD can have its hand in EUAs fast tracking these medical priorities. So we fast forward to July of 2020, and we start looking at the contracts now. And this was 5 months really before we saw General Perna there go on the podium and say, this is D-Day. 5 months before that, the U.S. starts looking at, the U.S. Health Agency start looking at manufacturing capability. Who can upscale this experimental mRNA vaccine platform? Who has the best capabilities to do this? We have this document, July 2020, and it says COVID-19 pandemic large-scale vaccine manufacturing demonstration. You can see at the bottom of this slide, requiring activity. It says it's a joint mission between the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense to combat COVID-19. So right there, they're both standing side by side doing, walkthroughs of the Pfizer plant, looking at manufacturing capability. Obviously, HHS is doing it from a public health standpoint. DOD is doing it from a militaristic standpoint. That's their goggles that they have on. So we go back into that document here, and it says at that time, this was when they were chosen, the government received and evaluated all proposals submitted and on a basis of selection has been executed, selecting Pfizer Incorporated as the awardee. It says the total approved costs to the government for this effort is not to exceed $1.95 billion and change there. And then you get to the actual contract. In December 2020, it says here, look in the scope of work. This is Pfizer's contract. Scope, the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services in support of national emergency response to the coronavirus disease 2019 requires the production of Pfizer vaccine BNT162b2 on the commercial item basis up to 500 million doses to inoculate members of the DoD and the general public. So both, you can see there, HHS has the public in mind, DoD has military members in mind. So you can see they're both have the same aims. They're both trying to get this, but they're separate. They're distinctly separate at that point. And then that moves on to international distribution. We have July 2021. We have the COVAX instrument, basically. This was to inoculate low and middle income countries, African countries. And we go in here and we look at the scope of that document. Again, the DOD is right in there. DOD, and they're paired up with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in support of the global response. And you can see in there, they're looking for 500 million vaccines as well for the COVAX. That's an advanced market commitment. So this is where we start going internationally with this. So that's really the distribution side of what's happening here. And again, you can see the military is married to the public health agencies. Although we don't see that too much in public. We see popped it up here, with Perna making that announcement. But you really, from there, it's very difficult to find the military's hand in this, especially publicly. But we go into the policy piece now, and this is really where the rubber meets the road, where the policy happens, who's making the policy, and how is that shaped, and how is that rolled out. So in 2006, we have the Public Health Service Act, and you can see even in here from a policy standpoint, this is really the gold standard. This is the Bible of how the United States works when there's an emergency. And it says this: the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall assume operational control of emergency public health and medical response assets as necessary in the event of a public health emergency. But then it goes on to say, except that members of the armed forces under the authority of the Secretary of Defense shall remain under the command and control of the Secretary of Defense, and shall any associated assets of the Department of the Defense. So you can see in there, again, even if there's emergency, we have two breakaway kind of civilizations there.
Well, and it's interesting, it says in control of assets, and we just saw that one of those assets is they're part of the purchase of these vaccines for both civilian and military, so that's an asset. So now you have to imagine, or they can be in control of that asset as it's delivered to the people.
Exactly. And so now we get to the coronavirus response. So we have all of this. We have all of this policy already written in there. We have the vaccine, the vaccine manufacturing. You see the parallel lines there. But now we have the actual plans. This is the plans from the White House. So in March 2020, the U.S. government puts out this document, and it's the U.S. government's COVID-19 response plan. So this is kind of how it goes and flows. So we start reading into this. It says, this plan outlines the United States government's coordinated federal response activities for COVID-19 in the United States. The president appointed the vice president to lead the U.S. government's effort, with the Department of Health and Human Services serving as the lead federal agency. And it just says after that, consistent basically with that Public Health Act. So you have Mike Pence. He's serving as the lead, and the lead federal agency is Health and Human Services. Mike Pence is really the figurehead here, so we're really looking at the organizations, not so much Mike Pence. So we go into this document here, and it says, on January 27th, the president's coronavirus task force was formed and charged with leading the U.S. government response. The task force was initially led by the Secretary of Health and Human Services and coordinated through the NSC, the National Security Council. So let's look at a flow chart on this document. And you can see at the top here in orange, White House Task Force is at the top. But to the left in that yellow box, who is dictating policy? The National Security Council. That is who is dictating the lockdowns, the masking, the vaccination mandates, everything, school closures, everything that had a meaningful impact or a negative impact, as our reporting has shown on this coronavirus response. So we go into the next flow chart. Remember, HHS was the leading agency. That was the head agency. And at the top here, you see HHS response structure. It's a big tree, but who's at the top? NSC, National Security Council. There it is again. They're getting the lead horse in the HHS's response. So let's put a name to this now. We have this agency. So in February of 2020, remember that was March. That was kind of the blueprints for how we're going to roll this out. So in February 2020, we started seeing headlines that look like this. White House names AIDS expert Deborah Birx to help lead coronavirus response. So now we have the Coronavirus Task Force Response Coordinator, Deborah Birx. She's on the board of directors of Operation Warp Speed, which was the distribution basically of the vaccines. And then she's the response coordinator at the National Security Council. So this is a person, remember now, Deborah Birx was this person, for as far as the public remembers, a woman, could have been someone's mother, grandmother, wore as a scarf, kind of dressed down, always behind President Trump, kind of in the shadows, not really saying too much, just kind of observing, standing next to Fauci. And that's where the public remembers about her. Now, here's another version of Deborah Birx that the public may not know about her. She was active duty military. So from 1980 to 1994, Birx served as an active duty reserve officer in the U.S. In 1985, Birx began her career with the DoD, the Department of Defense, as a military-trained clinician in immunology, focusing on AIDS and HIV vaccine research.
I remember them really celebrating the AIDS part, but not the fact that she's really military. Really
absolutely
right.
And so from 94 to 2008, she was active duty regular military. She achieved the rank of colonel. So this is not a minor person. This is a very serious person. This is a very serious person with both a military career and some vaccine research and a medical career. Right. So what is the first thing she does when she gets in there? Remember, Mike Pence is basically the head, the go-to guy under President Trump. So the response that's carried out should be from the dictates of President Trump, Mike Pence, and their cabinet, if you will. These are the headlines. As soon as Birx gets her hands on the controls, this is what we're looking at. Top Trump advisor bluntly contradicts president on COVID-19 threat, urging all-out response. She starts really contradicting him and going against his will, and that was just one of several articles showing this at that time. So how did she get there? It said White House picked, but really when we start to look at this, the Brownstone Institute did a great article titled The Talented Mr. Pottinger. And this is the headline here. You can read this. The U.S. intelligence agent who pushed lockdowns. Now, who is Mr. Pottinger? This is Matthew Pottinger. He is a decorated intelligence officer. And we start to go into this article, and it says this. Pottinger became a decorated intelligence officer and met General Michael Flynn, who later appointed him to the National Security Council. There it is again. Pottinger was originally in line to be China director, but Flynn gave him the more senior job of Asia director. In 2019 of September, Pottinger was named Deputy National Security Advisor, second only to National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Now it gets to the coronavirus. It says, on January 14th, Pottinger authorized a briefing for the NSC staff by the State Department and the Department of Health and Human Services, along with CDC Director Redfield. The first interagency meeting to discuss the situation in Wuhan wasn't prompted by official intelligence. In fact, there was practically none of it. Now, Pottinger was in China. He was seeing what was happening on the ground, and he did this on his own. Now, it goes on to say, on January 27, 2020, Trump's staff attended the first full meeting on the coronavirus in the White House Situation Room. Unbeknownst to those in attendance, Pottinger had unilaterally called the meeting. Others urged calm, but Pottinger immediately began pushing for travel bans. So now, Del, we go to link these two up now. So we have Pottinger, we have Birx. Where's the connection? Well, it's actually in Deborah Birx's own book. She wrote a kind of a weird bragging tell-all book in 2022 called The Silent Invasion. And we go into that book and we start to read some of the things that were in this book as quoted. On January 28th, after meeting with Aaron Walsh to solidify the planning and schedule for the upcoming African Diplomatic Corps State Department meeting, I received a text from Yen Pottinger. Aside from being the wife of my friend Matt, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Yen was also a former colleague at the CDC and a trusted friend and neighbor. Goes on to say, Matt had apologized for the short notice and said he hoped we could meet face to face. Yen arranged that so I can meet him in the West Wing, and once we were both there, Matt got to the point quickly. He offered me the position of the White House spokesperson on the virus. So now we go into, now we understand how she got there. And remember, both Birx and Pottinger had a kind of a similar view of this virus, which was, you know, COVID zero. We can't have any cases whatsoever, and we need some harder lockdowns.
Right.
We need to keep these lockdowns going a little further. So we go into another article here, and this was again, Brownstone Institute is doing some great reporting on this, and it talks about Birx specifically. And in this article, it's quoting Pottinger when he's talking to Birx. So Pottinger says this to Birx: "You should take over Azar, Fauci, and Redfield's jobs because you're such a better leader than they are." And that was out of her book. So Pottinger is seeing what's going on, allegedly, is from these words, seeing what's going on with Azar at HHS, with Fauci, with Redfield, and he's saying, we need somebody else in there. These guys are not really doing as good of a job, or perhaps the job
or
we
more
want
specifically, we need the military, you know, voicing this and driving this, not, you know, all of these sort of science, CDC, NIH people.
Right, exactly. And now something happens, though. We enter a gentleman named Scott Atlas. He was put on this coronavirus task force, and he was somebody that was kind of a medical lead. And he, as you remember, as we covered him, he started talking kind of outside the narrative a little bit. He started giving some real scientific data. And that didn't last too long. He was in there for a little while, but then he was relieved of that position. And of course, the media viciously attacked him during and after that. And so we
celebrated him big time here on the High Wire. He's on my bucket list of people that I'm just dying to interview on this issue, because he got in there and suddenly we had someone that was not carrying this WHO, DOD, now that we're looking at this narrative. He was giving a different perspective, which was more of a scientifically based perspective that you could put evidence behind, instead of all this 6 feet distancing, which had no science behind it, masks, which we knew every scientific study said didn't actually work, a vaccine that was going to be rushed out that had been problematic in animal trials. So it was just such a relief. It was just sad that he got in there and Trump didn't seem to give him any power to do anything.
Right. And looking back, we can really point to him as one of the beginning people who kickstart the open scientific debate about the real science and the real health conversations that were surrounding this. And so he writes his book, and these are some quotes from his book, some of the reporting on his book, and we're going to talk about this now. So he says this: in his book, Atlas observes with puzzlement and consternation that although Pence was the nominal director of the task force, Deborah Birx was the person in charge. He says Birx's policies were enacted throughout the country in almost every single state for the entire pandemic. This cannot be denied, he says. It cannot be deflected. He goes on to say this: this was his bird's eye view within that organization. Not only that, but no matter how much Trump or anyone in the administration disagreed with Birx, the White House was held hostage to the anticipated reaction of Dr. Birx, and she was not to be touched, period. He goes on to say this about Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci held court in the public eye on a daily basis, so frequently that many misconstrue his role as being in charge. However, it was really Dr. Birx who articulated task force policy. All the advice from the task force to the states came from Dr. Birx. All written recommendations about their on-the-ground policies were from Dr. Birx. Dr. Birx conducted almost all the visits to states on behalf of the task force. Very interesting information. And Del, I can say right here, from combing through thousands of internal emails, of Fauci's internal emails, from almost every organization that put a FOIA, including the Informed Consent Action Network, there was little evidence of Fauci crafting or setting policy.
I have to sit here and say, though we've had all the evidence correct here, we have definitely, it worked. The court jester even distracted our attention a little bit. We've been very focused on Fauci. We didn't let Birx out of our sights, and we have discussed her many times, and the fact that, she clearly has contradicted herself and even came out saying now, I always knew the vaccine wasn't going to stop transmission. But you do realize that, now, wow, So you don't really recognize she's military. You don't recognize that the NSC is involved in this. And so what it appears is this is being driven, and you have to imagine she's having meetings we don't know about that are driving this DOD, a military agenda. And now when I think about it, it all kind of makes sense, right? We were trying to say, folks, this is feeling a lot like martial law, but the part of it that kept your mind from saying it was martial law was you didn't see any tanks or military. But if she'd been standing there in camouflage every time she was telling us they were locking us down, and now you're going to have to wear masks, and now you're going to be forced to get this vaccine if you want to go to work, we would have probably started seeing this in a much different light.
Right. And the question becomes what it was when I started out the segment. Where did this virus come from? Who knew what, and when did they know it? So if this becomes a question of a lab leak that people knew and decided to do perhaps a military response over just a wait and see or just a public emergency, it puts things in a whole different light. So this is why this information about lab origins is, it's passed for a lot of people, but it's really important to understand this because at the drop of a hat, we have Jeremy Farrar, we have other people talking about, the coming in director of the WHO saying, we're going to need to get ready now for the next pandemic. Are we to expect that the second the hammer drops the next pandemic, we're under this quasi-military martial law? We really have to pay attention to what's going on with this.
You're right. And as you sort of laid this out, I even now have to think about the fact that Pottinger, what is in charge of Asia? He's the one overlooking all things happening in Asia. Why does that end up, Then he moves into this powerful position. All of it, all of this weird interconnection between China, Asia, the United States of America, the WHO, and now this military, the way you're, bringing this in. I mean, this has been an incredible journey this last few weeks with you, Jeffrey, sort of, listing out the past, sort of how we see these decisions and eugenics coming up through the system and then into military. In some ways, what you have to ask yourself now, was this a military exercise? Or, because, at the heart of this, a military guy saying this is, D-Day, I just keep thinking for a virus that had a death rate of ultimately 0.35% of everybody there, and for people like under 60, really we're in the 0.05% space. So really, was this really the war of all wars? Did they know it was that weak the whole time? Certainly by by the time this vaccine is coming along, everyone should have known it. We knew it. We were reporting this is, essentially a bad flu, hardly, World War III. But it never stopped. And now we look at this, the way it was driven through.